Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who are joining our panel today, who are joining our discussion. It's a great pleasure on behalf of Ms. Cristina Duarte, the Under-Secretary General and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Africa, for me to welcome you to this exciting conversation on unlocking the value of Africa's intangible assets, intellectual property, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. I am Jean-Paul Adam, and I am the Director in the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. And for those who are not familiar with the work of OSAA, the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, I would like to note that the office mandate aims to enhance international support for Africa's development, peace, and security through its advocacy and analytical work. This mandate is implemented through four key functional roles, namely advisory, advocacy, coordination, and monitoring. And today's discussion of the members of the consultative platform on intellectual property of the OSAA Knowledge Network is the third in a series of conversations on various intellectual property rights-related issues of relevance to Africa's Sustainable Development Agenda. Intellectual property and the enforcement of those rights and the development of the economic opportunities around intellectual property will be critical for accelerating the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and also the African Union Agenda 2063. So the objective of these series are to raise awareness of the importance of intellectual property among African policymakers, promote information sharing on intellectual property policymaking and implementation, and propose intellectual property policy options with a view to unlock the value of Africa's intangible assets. As reported by the World Intellectual Property Organization in 2022, the use of IP rights is still limited in Africa compared to other regions. For instance, Africa accounts for only 0.6% of the world's patent applications compared to 67.6% in Asia, 18.5% in North America, and 10.5% in Europe. Furthermore, the resident share only accounts for 12.8% compared to 82.7% in Asia, 56.2% in Europe, and 42.5% in North America. This means that in an African context, it's non-residents that own most of the registered patents. This indicates, on the other hand, a vast untapped potential for growth and development in Africa. And Africa actually has a strong tradition of innovation and creativity. However, it has often struggled to realize the full economic potential of this tradition. Moreover, not all of Africa's innovations, many of which take place at the grassroots and informal levels, may not be reflected in official intellectual property statistics. Similarly, while traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions are increasingly recognized as crucial factors in promoting sustainable development, under the conventional intellectual property system, traditional knowledge has been considered part of the public domain and freely available for anyone to use, and thus susceptible to unwanted misappropriation and misuse. Despite these challenges, traditional knowledge has not been fully protected by Africa's legal systems. For example, only 9 African countries have so far taken steps to enact national legislation and policies to protect and promote traditional knowledge, including the establishment of sui generis systems, which of course is a system of its own kind. And these are special forms of protection which can address the unique characteristics of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. We will hear from some of our panelists of some of these examples. I can note, for example, that Zambia has enacted the Protection of Traditional Knowledge, Genetic Resources and Expressions of Folklore Act, but we will hear of some other examples also across the continent. It may be necessary for us to therefore consider a paradigm shift from common heritage for public benefit to economic investments that require the legal protection of Africa's traditional knowledge and heritage. It's against this backdrop that OSAA is organizing this panel discussion, and the discussion aims to provide a global platform for African intellectual property experts, such as yourselves, to present your insights and perspectives on the issues of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, especially in terms of how African countries could unlock the value of their intangible assets, which remain largely untapped. For today's panel discussion, we are joined by three distinguished experts of the OSAA African Knowledge Network consultative platform on intellectual property. And I'm delighted to welcome them. We have Dr. Francis Kariuki, the advocate of the High Court of Kenya and lecturer at the Strathmore University Law School, Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome, Dr. Kariuki. We have Dr. Charlene Musiza, academic researcher and consultant based currently in Geneva, Switzerland. And we have Dr. Tolulope Adekola, the research fellow at the TC Byrne School of Law, Queensland University, Brisbane, Australia, who is joining us from already Friday. So we are immensely appreciative that it's the middle of the night for him and is joining the discussion to facilitate as moderator. So Dr. Adekola will be moderating, and after the interactive discussion among the three intellectual property experts, Ms. Rumbidzai Adebayo, the Program Management Officer of OSA, will deliver brief closing remarks. I would also like to note for everyone that this meeting is taking place in English and French. It is being covered bilingually. And for those who would like to follow the discussion in French, please use the interpretation button, which is in the lower left corner of the screen, where you can choose either English or French. Pour vous qui suivez en français, vous pouvez appuyer sur le bouton de l'interprétation à gauche de l'écran. Merci. So without further ado, I will shortly hand over to Dr. Adekola, but I would also like to especially recognize the efforts of my colleague, Kei Tagawa, in putting this together. Thank you very much, Kei. And Dr. Adekola, over to you. You have the floor, and I look forward to hear the discussion.
For that introduction, and many thanks to the United Nations Office of Special Advisor. Nourished its people for generations. But this treasure of knowledge has faced challenges, as traditional knowledge is increasingly threatened by modern practices, international intellectual property system, and global market demands. So this panel discussion is a testament to the pressing need to protect, to preserve, and promote African traditional knowledge and the intellectual property rights of its custodians. So we are here to explore questions that touch the very essence of African identity, like how can we ensure that traditional knowledge is respected and rewarded in a globalized world? How can intellectual property systems be adapted to safeguard indigenous innovation while still fostering progress and development? So today I'm privileged to be sharing this discussion with two renowned experts in the field of intellectual property law. So I have Dr. Charlene Mosiza, who is a renowned IP scholar and researcher. And I also have Dr. Francis Karaoke, um, who is a lecturer at Strathmore University in Kenya. So they will share their insights, experiences, and success stories stemming from their research in this evolving field. So without further ado, let's begin the conversation, and I would like to start with you, Dr. Francis. So, in a world where traditional knowledge is a prominent topic of discussion at international, regional, and national levels, so Francis, can you help demystify what traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expression truly constitutes? Like, what are the core elements of these two concepts?
Thank you so much, Dr. Tolu. Thank you to the organizers of this forum. I do appreciate the opportunity to be able to share a few thoughts. So, thank you for that question, Dr. Tolu. And I would say basically that traditional knowledge, broadly speaking, is the knowledge that local, traditional, indigenous communities have used over the years for sustenance of their livelihoods. And the knowledge, traditional knowledge, they usually develop it out of generations and many years of interactions with nature and amongst themselves. So it is a very vital kind of knowledge because it also captures the innovations of our local people, of our indigenous groups, of our local communities, but it also captures their traditional practices that they have used over the years in conservation of nature, conservation of forests, in conservation of the indigenous plant varieties. They have used this knowledge in developing their technical, architectural aspects, and also
mm,
it touches on skills that they use, for example, in developing their cultural artifacts, traditional baskets, traditional mats. It is the same knowledge that they use in terms of expressing also their cultural, their social, their spiritual dimensions of life. And
mm,
this now brings in the linkage with traditional cultural expressions, because the cultural expressions are actually manifestations of the traditional knowledge, the skills, the innovations, the practices of indigenous people, now being manifested, for example, through traditional songs, traditional dances, through traditional crafts, handbags that they develop, traditional clothing, etc., etc. And
mm.
in terms of typologies or categories of traditional knowledge, as I've said, it speaks to a very wide spectrum of things. It touches on
Mm,
the ecological, what we call ecological knowledge, knowledge that is vital and that the
mm.
world is yearning for in terms of conservation of environment, in terms of tackling the challenges of climate change. It speaks to agricultural knowledge. Our indigenous people, local people have immense knowledge that is vital towards improving food security in Africa in terms of
Mm.
how they conserve their seeds, how they preserve their traditional indigenous food systems, etc., etc. So this in basically is the knowledge, and it's a rich resource that Africa has. That
Mm.
I'm very happy to see the work of OSA in terms of trying to promote awareness and how it can be used towards the sustainable development of
Wow.
Africa. Back to you,
Um,
Tolu.
yeah, that's quite interesting. It's interesting to hear from you, like um, those practical examples you've given, on of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, and so now I would want you to speak to the challenges posed by the global intellectual property system, because it appears that the narrative is that Africa is not innovative, whether in the Greek sector or in terms of traditional medicines, or in the quality of of our cultural expressions. So I would want you to speak to the challenges posed by the global intellectual property system when it comes to ownership and innovation, in helping to safeguard, preserve, and derive commercial benefits from this very good examples of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions you've mentioned.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tolu. Yeah, traditionally, we have used the intellectual property system and institutions to protect creations of the mind, and that being the case, the focus has been the use of IP, and IP, as you may know. It uses different matrices for measuring creativity. And so, if you look at the various IP tools, for example, patents, the traditional knowledge may not meet the patentability criteria when it comes to novelty, because traditional knowledge has been there for generations and it continues to develop over the years. If it's other requirements, for example, within copyright, again, you still see with copyright, with patents, the focus on an individual inventor or creator of the expression of the innovation, and that presents a challenge because traditional
mm,
knowledge and cultural expressions are generated in a collective context. So it may not meet the stringent requirements for patentability, copyrights, etc., etc. Again,
mm,
the intergenerational aspect, the fact that this knowledge was developed by past, present generations, means that it becomes very hard to identify who is the innovator, who is the
mm,
inventor, who is the
mm,
creator of this knowledge.
mm.
And that's a big challenge using the IP system.
System.
Again, the holistic nature of traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. Traditional knowledge is not just about the creations, the innovative aspect. It's also about protecting the indigenous territories of the communities. It's about protecting the cultural, spiritual context
Mm,
within which this knowledge exists. But IP focuses only on the intellectual creations. It ignores
mm,
the ecological dimensions, the spiritual, etc., etc. And
mm,
traditional knowledge and cultural expressions require holistic kind of protection. Again,
mm.
if you look at the duration of protection, most
Okay.
IP tools have a limited duration of protection, and this presents a challenge. Without even mentioning the fact that the development of international IP instruments did not take into account the views and the participation of indigenous peoples in their development, and that
And
is a challenge that we
wow.
continue to face.
Wow, that's really interesting. That's really really interesting. I love the way you highlighted those challenges, which are quite fundamental actually. So now to you, Dr. Charlin, Francis has been able to identify the challenges posed by the global IP system. But in your view, do you see opportunities rather than challenges with the absence of an international IP governance structure for traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions for Africa, like the fact that the current IP system does not fit neatly into what constitutes traditional knowledge. Do you think it's an opportunity for Africa to carve a niche for itself, or it's a challenge we would have to continue to grapple with?
Okay, thank you so much, Tolu. I think when we think of how laws develop, we notice that most of our systems come from the top down, right? So we start with something from an international framework and then it trickles down into our national frameworks. And I think that's been the expectation, at least with all systems, all legal systems. But the fact that we don't have protection internationally for traditional cultural expressions at the global level, it offers an opportunity to start from the bottom up. So
Hmm,
some that comes from within a national context, within a regional context, that then filters in to the discussions at a global level.
hmm,
I think one of the regional laws that I think for me is quite good and progressive is the Swakopmund Protocol, which is within the framework of the African Regional IP Organization, ARIPO. What this does is it brings together all those very contentious issues for which we don't have an international legal framework and tries to find ways of protecting them in the absence of IP,
of
whether it's
IP.
bringing in together some aspects of the IP system that fit and some very nuanced sui generis sort of like systems.
Hmm,
If I can just highlight maybe just one thing,
hmm,
what you have, for instance, within the Swakopmund Protocol for traditional cultural expressions is wording that sort of mirrors what you have with moral rights and economic rights under copyright.
hmm,
You
hmm,
also have a bit of wording that mirrors what you have with geographical indications protection. So that gives
hmm,
you an opportunity to sort of like tailor something new that addresses the specific characteristics of traditional cultural expression and traditional knowledge,
hmm,
but at the same time is not burdened with the sort of legal requirements that Francis mentioned, which make the system difficult to apply for traditional cultural expressions and traditional knowledge. So I
hmm.
think it offers an opportunity
On the chip.
for something that is from the bottom up to
Hmm,
influence the legal framework at a global
hmm.
at a global
Global.
stage.
Well, that's quite fascinating because what we've always heard is, oh, there's no international framework, and as such, that's why we are not really leveraging our traditional knowledge and really making the best out of this. But yeah, I understand you've conducted significant research in Zambia or on Zambia regarding traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. Like, I really love to hear good things, the positive sides of things. So could you share some of the noteworthy findings of your work, shedding light on the value and challenges associated with traditional knowledge in this context in Zambia?
Okay, so what I did is I looked at the Zambian piece of legislation because it's one of the very few that's inspired by the Swakopmund Protocol, which I mentioned.
Hmm.
And what I like about the Zambia's legislation, at least I'll just call it the TK Act for short,
Hmm. Okay.
is that it has a preamble which situates the context within indigenous and local communities, right? It recognizes that ownership and custodianship of traditional cultural expressions, traditional knowledge, and genetic resources vests with the indigenous and local communities. I think that's very key to put right at the start. That recognition and attribution, it situates the context. And then in addition, it has sort of like a two-way prong approach to protecting traditional cultural expression, which was my focus. It has a provision where you can use the IP system to the extent that it works, right? When you think of collective trademarks or certification trademarks, which are essentially IP rights of a collective nature. But at the same time, it also produces or provides for a sui generis system of protection for traditional cultural expressions. And by default, they are protected. So there is no formality requirements for you to engage with before you recognize and protect traditional cultural expressions. I think that's probably the first crucial thing.
Hmm.
Then it has got certain rights that it attributes to those custodians, which is like the wording that you find, for instance, in corporate. So you cannot mutilate or you cannot enjoy the economic rights that are attendant to those traditional cultural expressions as you would any other sort of like IP right. And in addition, it also prohibits reproduction and distribution, which has similar wording that you find within copyright, for instance. Also, what it does is it allows for the traditional community to engage with any other third party if they want to commercialize, right?
Hmm.
So if the authority, which is PACRA, that's the IP authority in Zambia, if they recognize and see that there's a need or a community approach them for a licensing or for a commercialization aspect, PACRA stands in place to help indigenous communities benefit from whatever commercialization happens with these traditional cultural expressions. So my research focused on baskets, which was
Hmm.
something very interesting for me. It was my first time to engage with such kind of research where I speak to people, social legal research, where I speak to
Hmm.
people and ask them about their thoughts and processes around this thing. And I can tell you this for everybody listening. The
Hmm.
most important thing is collective ownership.
Hmm.
Within the IP system, there's an individual owner, a sole creator. There's
Hmm.
that one.
Hmm.
But within communities, it's a collective. So when they
Hmm.
think of protection, they think of, okay, if I own it, how about my neighbor? How about my
Hmm.
community?
Hmm.
Right? So that aspect of collectiveness is very crucial and very central to any idea we can have about protecting traditional
Hmm.
knowledge, traditional
Wow.
cultural expressions.
That's quite interesting and quite interesting. I think I've read your work and I really found it very fascinating. So Francis, like, now let's just be very practical now. Like, what Africans want to see is, we want to see our African traditional medicines being sold across the world. We want the world uh, to have a feel of what Africa is actually made of. We want to see our knowledge products. Um, we want to see, tangible progress regarding our traditional cultural expressions and traditional knowledge. What exactly do you think is the role of African states and the role of IP offices, museums, local governments, organizations, local communities? What can we do uh, to actually leverage on this very rich culture and showcase what Africa has to offer the world?
Thank you so much, Dr. Tolu. I think, in my view, there is a lot that can be done by different actors in terms of uh, promoting and protecting the traditional knowledge of our people, even with the lacuna that we are seeing at the international level in terms of lack of an international treaty. I think already our people are using the IP system, as Charlene has said, be it certification marks, be it collective marks, to protect their knowledge where the IP system can accommodate that, which is a good thing. We are also seeing a number of African countries, I think Botswana, Namibia, including the disclosure of origin requirement in their patent laws. And I think this is a very nice way of protecting our traditional knowledge, in spite of the fact that we don't have an international legal obligation amongst all states to do so. The fact that they are also including the prior and informed consent as a requirement to
Mm,
third parties before they access knowledge. That again, I see as a way of protecting traditional knowledge from being misused or misappropriated by third parties. So
mm,
I think IP offices in Africa needs to be more deliberate in terms of requiring this disclosure. But of course, it will require that we include these requirements in our laws, because we don't know when the international instruments
mm.
will make
Yeah.
a legal mandate. And then
Mm,
I would say for local governments, in Kenya, we have a sui generis law, the Traditional Knowledge and Cultural Expressions Act. It makes provision for the role of county governments or devolved governments. And I think this becomes critical in terms of the development of traditional knowledge registers and the documentation of TK, because it will ensure participation, as Charlene has said, at the local level by our people. My research has shown, for example, the role that non-governmental organizations, civil society, are playing, working in collaboration with communities in terms of actually commercializing
mm,
traditional knowledge with their consent. For example, traditional medicine, they are able to develop drugs which are able to be put into forms that can be marketed outside there, which I think is a right step in terms of commercializing. But it requires the consent and the consensus of the local communities. I have
mm,
seen NGOs also in Kenya reviving the traditional knowledge systems and ecosystems, which are vital for the survival of traditional knowledge.
mm,
And they are actually reviving some of these traditional systems, traditional knowledge systems, food systems, by relying on the experts, the
mm,
elders, and those who are holders of traditional knowledge.
mm,
This is important. And then, of
mm,
course, for communities, I think they have a key role. They need to have biocultural protocols which will govern, even if we don't have a strict law at the international level requiring these, governing who accesses, when this knowledge can be accessed, and including also the beneficiary arrangements. Because I think through those beneficiary arrangements that the community can be able to assert and say what they want to be compensated
mm.
when their knowledges, their traditional cultural expressions are used by third
Yeah.
parties.
So, thank you very much for that point, Francis. And I will just go to Charlene, building on the last statement you made, Francis. So, Charlene, very quickly, can you just talk to the issue of ownership and who is going to benefit from this? Like, if a community owns a particular knowledge, let's say traditional medicine, for instance, and it's owned by a particular indigenous community, and then now we are talking of commercializing this knowledge and selling it at the global stage. In terms of who gets the benefit, how do you think the law should allocate benefits? Who benefits? Who? What constitutes an indigenous community? Yeah, if you can just speak to that very briefly. Yeah.
Okay. So I think maybe what's important is to highlight how many people are involved or how many parties are involved in such a transaction. So you've got the indigenous community, you've got the IP authority, and you've got the third party who's coming in who wants to commercialize the knowledge. Now, because the wealth of knowledge has been accumulated over generations in the community, it is only just and fair that the bulk of benefit accrues to the indigenous community, right?
mm,
The IP authority here simply plays a role in facilitating whatever agreement will come forth, right? Because the idea is that we want the owners of the knowledge to benefit, right?
mm,
And I think with most protocols or most soft laws and even legal provisions that we have, there is that element of embedding the customary principles, customary values, customary governance, and the owners of the traditional knowledge being the beneficiaries and the custodians. They're the custodians, they're the beneficiaries, and they hold this in custodian on behalf of future generations. So if any benefit is to accrue, it has to accrue to those who are the owners. And I think that's probably the most important thing to highlight. It's very easy when we are discussing or negotiating or thinking about IP to think of protecting. It's not protecting for the sake of protecting, it's for who, right? And in
mm,
this case, it's for the indigenous community. And I like that with most pieces of legislation, that is included. I think
mm,
Dr. Francis mentioned Kenya. It also mentions that, right? That the idea is that we need the indigenous community to be the ones who are benefiting from whatever commercialization that you have of their knowledge or their traditional cultural expressions.
mm. Wow, that's interesting. So the sense I'm getting now is um, IP has a role to play in terms of commercialization for the economic benefits. It also has a role to play in terms of preserving the rights of this uh, indigenous communities, and giving them the right to give access and to continue to preserve it over the future. I mean, for the future generation. So that's quite interesting. So, Francis, very quickly, I would want you to speak to WIPO. Now, there are several conversations going on the international stage on traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. What do you think African states should be pushing for at the international stage? Because, of course, even though we are saying that international, like we do not have an international framework yet, we still need the international framework, of course, to forestall biopiracy and just, you know, companies coming down and then taking our genetic resources and then selling it back to us. So now, what should be the position of African states as the world is now negotiating, uh, sort of a unified framework for traditional knowledge governance at the global stage? Very quickly.
Thank you so much, Tolu, for that question. I think speaking to WIPO and the discussions that are going on at the national level, I would number one, of course, say we need to push as an African group for a very mandatory disclosure requirement at the national level, so that all states actually include this as a requirement. I think that's the only way that will be able to standardize and have TK, TCs protected across the board, and also the related genetic resources. I wouldn't actually propose that the issue of the voluntary, where it's dependent on the willingness of some states. I know it will be difficult, but I think the African group need to be very specific. As Shalina has said, this is the knowledge of the TK holders, those people who have been involved, who have labored, they need a reward. So I would strongly say that we need to push for a very mandatory requirement in terms of the IP frameworks, the patent laws. But number two, also a very stringent requirement about the PIC, the free prior informed consent
Mm,
of the TK holders being consulted before their knowledges are actually utilized by third parties, before their cultural expressions is utilized by third parties. But also the uncomfortable conversation. What happens about the TCEs, the TK that is already being used outside
mm,
there
mm,
without indigenous people, local communities benefiting? What kind of arrangements ought we to have at the national level, regional level, and municipal level? And lastly, I would say the African people, because we have the normative frameworks that govern the growth and the development of TK and cultural expressions. That's the customary laws. We cannot forget about these normative frameworks within which TKTCEs are actually generated. And I
Mm.
think also harmonizing and ensuring that the regime of customary law is actually protected by states across the board, because it's through that regime that TKTCEs are actually generated and they continue to survive.
Wow, thank you very much for that brilliant response. So I would just like to get our final thoughts. So now you will start first, Dr. Charlene. So in 1 minute, what can we do, or what can we continue to do? Like, just, I would love to hear your advice, like speaking to Africans. Like, traditional knowledge is a part of our identity. In fact, as Francis mentioned, it's a part of our spirituality, our connection to the land. So, passionately, you've worked in this field. What can we do? Very briefly, if you can just speak to that.
I think in under a minute, the only thing that I can say is let's take advantage of existing protocols, existing soft laws, existing regional laws. Let's take advantage of those, make them very nuanced for our context, and come up with our own protection mechanisms in our countries. There is no restriction. Nothing stops African countries from developing their own laws that work for them. In the absence of an international framework, let's take advantage of existing regional frameworks.
Hmm. That's very punchy and very brilliant. Thank you for that. So, Francis, just to wrap it up, your final thoughts on this very important topic that is, generating controversies across the world. Actually, not only in Africa, like indigenous communities across the world are craving for protection for their traditional knowledge. What would be your final thoughts?
Thank you so much. I think my final thought, in addition to what Charlene has said, because I agree with her fully, I think also a lot of change in terms of attitude towards our own traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. The mindset which tells Africans that our knowledge systems, our belief systems are archaic and scientific. I think governments across Africa, we need to change this kind of mentality, who bewitched us to think that our own knowledge systems are backward. They
Hmm.
are being used by our people to
Hmm.
for survival, for protecting their natural resources, etc., etc. So I would
Hmm.
say, especially the formal institutions, the formal actors, we need to change our attitude. As Charlene was saying, the top-down mentality, I think, has contributed to this actual erosion of our traditional knowledge and cultural expressions.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Francis and Dr. Charlene. Like, I really enjoyed this conversation so much, and your brilliant insights regarding this topic. And I'm very confident we're going to have very tangible impacts going forward. So, throughout our discussion today, we have uncovered the challenges of protecting traditional knowledge from misappropriation and the urgent need to establish mechanisms that honor the rights of indigenous communities in Africa. So we have also recognized the role of intellectual property frameworks in striking a balance between preservation and progress. However, beyond the challenges, we have discovered countless stories of resilience, like the Zambian story, and of creativity, the Kenyan story, and of hope. And our panelists today have also shared their experiences and insights in this regard. But the journey does not end here. It continues in the hearts and minds of everyone who has been part of this discussion today, and it extends to each of us who are passionate about preserving the treasures of African culture. Thank you very much for listening and participating, and we look forward to hearing your feedbacks. Thank you so much, Dr. Francis and Dr. Moses, for this very brilliant conversation, which I enjoyed so much. So I'll now hand over to Mrs. Rombi Adebayo to deliver a brief closing remarks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Adikola, for your excellent moderation, as well as Dr. Musiza and Dr. Karaoke for your thorough examination, insightful discussion, and concrete policy options to unlock the value of intangible assets, namely traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions in Africa. While I will not endeavor to summarize the substantive aspects of today's discussion, which has been done superbly by Dr. Adikola, I would like to just to underline the importance of Africa's traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. These intangible assets should be fully protected and leveraged to generate returns as any other assets for Africa's economic development. In terms of the way forward, the recorded videos will be available both in English and French on OSA's YouTube site in the forthcoming weeks. You may search UN Office of the Special Advisor on Africa on YouTube to find the office page. Furthermore, based on today's fruitful discussion, a written policy brief will be published on OSA's website in the coming months. And once published, we will inform you through OSA's Twitter X account, namely at UNOSAA1. And a special thanks to my dear colleague Kay Tagawa for organizing today's panel discussion. And thank you very much once again for your participation in today's discussion on intellectual property rights. We look forward to your engagement in our forthcoming initiatives. Thank you all, and goodbye.